Hello and welcome to another video review, except, well, not quite a review, of Strangeland for PC. Now I'll explain a bit more about what I mean by this not being quite a review in a moment, but what is Strangeland itself? Well, it's a point-and-click adventure game developed by Wormwood Studios and published by Wajidai Games in May of this year, and it's actually a game I've been looking forward to for quite a while. This is by the same developers that made Primordia, which if you haven't seen my video on that, it was quite a while ago, but suffice to say, that game was absolutely fantastic, and if you like point-and-click adventure games, you should definitely give Primordia a try. But Strangeland is an altogether very different beast. Instead of a sort of post-apocalyptic sci-fi game like you had with Primordia, this is really a much more surreal horror game. And those of you who followed me for a while may know that I don't particularly like horror games, so me looking forward to a horror game would be a very odd thing indeed. But this isn't doing what most horror games do. It's not just a bunch of jump scares one after the other, which are not actually scary, that's just startling. It's actually focusing more on a sense of atmosphere as well as a more psychological kind of horror, and that is the kind of horror that I do find quite interesting. Plus, it's a point-and-click adventure game, and I liked their previous work, so it seemed like a no-brainer there. So I bought a copy of the game as soon as I could, and unfortunately at the time I was working on other projects, so it took me a while to get around to playing through it. And the general reception I was seeing was trending very heavily towards the positives, so I was very much looking forward to playing this thing by the time I did finally get a chance to play it. When that time finally arrived, I installed the game, I started it up, and I started playing all the way through it. And then I finished the game, and I wasn't exactly sure how to process it. Which is a very rare thing to happen for me. Usually when I play through something, or I watch a movie or a TV show, or I read a book, or whatever the case may be, I pretty much know what I think about it after having gone through it. And at that point, it basically just becomes a matter of parsing those thoughts into a form that can be understood by other people. So, for example, with video games, that becomes what I have to parse into the commentaries that you get in my reviews and MTOs and such. But in the case of Strangeland, I wasn't sure what I thought about it. I wasn't sure whether I actually enjoyed the game or not. I wasn't sure whether I actually kinda hated the game or not. It was a bit of an odd ride there. And after having thought about it for quite a while, I did finally manage to piece together some coherent thoughts about the game. But before I get into the real meat of those, I want to mention some very important things about Strangeland. It deals with some very heavy subject matter, namely things like self-harm and self-destructive behavior, as well as grief and mental illness, and if that sort of thing bothers you, then Strangeland is definitely not the game for you. But if you know you can handle that kind of content, then the rest of this video might prove useful for you. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and start delving into the things that I can more objectively assess about the game, like the graphics, the sound design, and the gameplay mechanics, before I get into the elements that are really going to make or break this thing for you, and what ultimately resulted in me not really being able to rank this on my typical score scale. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get things started. So like always, we'll go ahead and start with the presentation, and this is a point-and-click adventure game using pixel art, and it's very well done pixel art. The animations are fairly simple, but they've done an absolutely fantastic job with creating this sort of nightmare carnival aesthetic, and between that and the often rather grotesque imagery that you're going to be seeing throughout the game, it does a rather good job of keeping things weird and unsettling as is befitting a psychological horror game. It also helps that the pixel art is of a higher resolution than what you normally see with this style of adventure game, and as such you are getting more detail out of everything. In addition, the interface is pretty clean and easy to work with, even though it is also quite heavily stylized, so they've done a very good job all around with the visuals. Then you move over into sound design, and that is also consistently high quality. The sound effects themselves are all quite fitting, although there's nothing really that stands out in that regard, and the soundtrack is suitably moody and contributes quite well to the rather ominous and oppressive atmosphere. But what really stands out as far as the sound design is concerned is the voice acting. The cast is excellently chosen, and they all play their roles very well. which is of course incredibly important in a story-driven game that has a lot of dialogue, but even more important in a game that is trying to go for a sense of horror atmosphere. So they've done a fantastic job with that, and when you look at the presentation as a whole, it's all extremely well done for this particular style of game. But of course, what really matter are the story and the gameplay, and unlike my usual format, I'm going to talk about the gameplay first, then the story, because the gameplay is the only other element of the game I can really objectively assess. So let's go ahead and get right into it. What you're dealing with here is a pretty typical point-and-click adventure game. As the name point-and-click adventure implies, you control the protagonist not by directly moving them around with movement keys or anything like that, but rather clicking on various things that you can interact with in the environment. If you right-click on something, the character will examine it and make a comment about it, and if you left-click on something, then it will try to interact with it in some way, whether that be using or talking to or trying to take it into your inventory or whatever the case may be. Whenever there's something in the environment that you can interact with or examine, then when you hover the mouse cursor over it, it will display whatever that thing is in text right above the cursor, and otherwise left-clicking around the environment will make the character move around. If you left-click on a character, then you'll initiate dialogue with them, and it will bring up a text box with a bunch of options you can select in order to discuss various topics with that character. As you progress through the game, you'll collect a variety of items that you can use to solve various puzzles, and you will have to interact with these in one of two ways. Either you will need to go into your inventory, select the item, and then select something in the environment to use it on, or you'll need to go into your inventory and click on some inventory item and click it on another inventory item in order to use the item that you selected first on whatever other item in your inventory is, or just to combine the two items. Generally speaking, the puzzles you'll need to solve throughout the game are not especially complicated, and some of them can be solved in multiple ways, which provides a bit of replay value as well as makes the puzzles a bit more interesting. After all, if you can solve some of them in multiple ways, it rewards working through the puzzles in different ways and coming to your own conclusions, which makes you feel like you have a bit more control over the game in general, as opposed to having to rely on moon logic like you see in a lot of older adventure games. That said, there isn't actually a failure state in the game either. It works more on the LucasArts school of adventure game design, where they feel like you should never get completely stuck. You should never be locked out of finishing the game because you made some poor decisions or whatever. In fact, failing is sometimes part of the puzzle design, because whenever the character dies, he just spawns right back up at the start of the area, and you can go right back to where you were and try things differently. And sometimes that's used as part of puzzles to give you some more information about what does and doesn't work, and what might be the solution to a problem. Even with that in place though, and even with you being able to try pretty much anything without the game punishing you for it, sometimes you'll come across situations where you're really not entirely sure what the game is telling you to do with them, and thankfully the developers have included a hint system in the game to help push you in the right direction in the form of the payphone in the very beginning of the game that you can go back to at any time in order to get a bit of a hint about what you need to do next. And when you bring all of that together, you end up with a system that works pretty well for the most part. It's very easy to pick up and play, and especially if you're familiar with adventure games, you're going to feel right at home here. That said, if you're not already a fan of point-and-click adventure games and you've never really found the mechanics of them all that impressive, then this one's not really going to impress you either. The mechanics here are fairly standard as far as point-and-click adventure games go. The thing is, point-and-click adventure games are usually on the weaker side as far as mechanics go because they put much more emphasis on the story, the characters, and the dialogue than anything else. And that is ultimately what is going to make or break this game for you, whether you're an adventure game fan or not. So what is the story of Strangeland? Well, you play as a guy who wakes up in this nightmarish carnival world, and almost immediately he finds himself stuck in a sort of loop where he encounters a golden-haired woman who proceeds to throw herself down a well over and over and over again, and he decides he has to save her. So he starts looking around the park and almost immediately finds this dark thing at the top of the park that he intuits is the reason she keeps throwing herself down that well, and as such, he decides he needs to destroy that dark thing and release her from this horrible fate. And as you wander around the park and try to find a way of doing this, you'll encounter a bunch of very strange characters with some rather interesting and quirky personalities that will speak to you in a rather cryptic manner that leaves you confused more often than not. And that confusion comes in multiple forms. The first is that, to some degree, this is also a mystery game, and you're trying to piece together that mystery as you progress. Basically, where are you? Who are you? Who is the golden-haired woman? What is the dark thing? And what does all of this mean? And as you progress, that will all become more clear, and you'll be able to understand exactly what's going on by the time you get to the end of the game. The problem is that getting to that point requires you to wade through everything else in the game, which is a sea of metaphors, symbolism, mythological references, references to literature, all manner of things where if you're just not familiar with the source material that's being referenced, all of the significance of it is going to be utterly lost on you. It's basically the situation where those people who do understand that source material are going to get the deeper meaning behind it and are going to feel much more connected with the game, whereas those who don't are at best going to just go, okay, there's something I'm missing here, but I'm going to power through this anyway, and at worst are going to get frustrated with the lack of understanding, like they're being talked down to by some pretentious art student who thinks they're a lot more intelligent than they are. And while I'm sure that's not what the developers intended, that's the kind of thing you'll run into when you release a game like this out to the general public. Not everybody is going to pick up what you're putting down. And that ultimately leads me to the central dilemma with Strangeland, the thing that made me not really sure how I felt about the game once I had finished it. Because on the one hand, there wasn't really any point throughout this entire game where I was actually having any fun. That's not to say that the game is completely devoid of humor, or that it's boring, or that it's outright bad, or anything of that nature. That's not remotely the case. It does have some quirky humor here and there. It is interesting, and it does have gameplay that is at least decent enough to where there's not really anything to complain about with it. But really the lack of fun comes from a combination of its subject matter, where this is basically musings on grief and loss and self-deprecating and self-destructive behavior, among other things, and that sense that there was just something I was missing, something that was lost in all of the metaphors and the flowery dialogue and all of the references that I just wasn't necessarily getting. And it also really didn't help that there wasn't anything truly grounding the story. Now, this is going into a bit of spoiler territory, so I'm going to put a time code up to where you can skip beyond the spoilery bit here. So fair warning to those of you who don't want to have the ending spoiled for you, although I'm going to try to keep things vague here. But when I say the story doesn't really have anything grounding it, I mean that the entire story takes place within the guy's head. There is no connection to anything remotely real world here. And no matter which of the 4 endings you get, you're still not going to see anything beyond this nightmare realm. You don't really feel like anything has truly been accomplished by the end of it. You just feel like you've been poking around in someone's thoughts as they've been going through some really nasty trauma, and you don't really know what to do with that. That is a very personal thing that you individually are going to have to figure out how to deal with. So that ultimately led to me not having any fun with the game at all, but that's not necessarily a deal breaker if it is a specific kind of not having fun. Because as I said before, the lack of fun was not because the game is bad or because it is boring, because it is neither of those things. It is a well-made adventure game that is very interesting. But after some thought, I ultimately came to the conclusion that I look at this in a similar light as something like Apocalypse Now. It goes into some dark places, and as such is not really fun or enjoyable in a traditional sense, and some of it can easily go over the audience's head. But at the same time, it's fascinating, and that's usually enough for people to give it a try. The difference is going to be whether or not it ultimately clicks, and that is something that is extremely subjective. Most people are either going to really love this game or they're really going to hate it, and there's not going to be much in between there. But if you do happen to be one of the ones that falls in between, then you're probably going to be closer to how I feel about it, which is to say that I'm glad I played through it. but I have a really hard time recommending it outright to a general audience. First, because it's a point-and-click adventure game, and that's a pretty niche genre overall, but even if you take that into account, I'm not really sure I can recommend it outright to a point-and-click adventure game fan either, because that's ultimately going to depend entirely on that individual. Are you willing to play a game that is more introspective, that delves into some really dark territory and isn't necessarily going to be fun, but is going to be interesting? Well, that's a question you're only going to be able to answer yourself. I just hope this video helps when it comes time to answer that question. Thanks for watching.